You're listening to IAM Pulse, a podcast discussing all things identity access management, from defending against cyber attacks and to enhancing your overall cybersecurity strategy. This podcast is brought to you by BioKey International, an innovative provider of flexible, secure access management and biometric identity solutions. We're sitting down to talk about the impact of identity access management makes on you and your business.
All right, so we will jump in and introduce our BioKey team members. So first, I'm Kim Johnson, VP of Product Marketing, really helping do the moderation today with two of my teammates. I'll let them introduce themselves. We do like to do a brief bio, so I've been with BioKey since last August, but this is my second tour with Portalguard, as we say, having worked with Portalguard in 2009 to 2013. I've had a career in IAM and cybersecurity ever since. And fun fact, we always do a fun fact to introduce ourselves. I decided is that I have a brother, my only sibling, and he works for Epic Games. So I grew up in a household, as you can imagine, that I have great skills in things like Magic the Gathering, Final Fantasy, and Warhammer. So for all those gamers out there that know at all what those things are, I'm in your camp. I have some of that knowledge. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christopher Perry. Quick intro and fun fact today, Christopher.
Awesome. So my name is Christopher Perry. As you can see, I'm a senior technical support engineer with Portalguard. I've been working on support for Portalguard for about 5 years now, a little over, and additional 10 years of support in customer service and issue resolution prior to that. So I'm no surprise to these kind of conversations. Brand new fun fact about me, I was actually pre-med for a while until I realized that I hated math. Then I decided to go into the technical field and learn a whole bunch of new skills that involved math, and now I realize that I just hated calc too. So you live and you learn.
Oh man, that was a tough course.
I managed to pass, but by the skin of my teeth.
Yeah, I'm glad you found IAM in the end. I mean, you know, where we all end up. All right, and Kevin, over to you. Short bio and your fun fact for the day.
Okay. Well, hi, Kevin Weiser, solutions architect. I've been with BioKey for a little over 2 years, and I've been in the IAM space for, well, really specifically in advanced authentication for a little over close to a decade, and then been in IT for as a sysadmin and started out as like a support tech, and for a better part of 20 years. So my fun fact is that I actually broke my arm and my leg in one accident in 2 separate events. So I rolled over a golf cart when I was 17 on a golf course, goofing around with some friends. And when I did so, I tried to step out of it rolling over, and I tore my left leg out and broke it, and then tried to put weight on it, and it dislocated, and I put my arm out to catch myself, and I shattered my forearm, both bones, the ulnar and the radius. It took 18 screws and 2 plates to put it all back together. So
Okay.
not many people could claim something like that.
So you're bionic, a little bit of bouncing in there, but we're glad you're okay.
Yeah.
And note to self, don't tear around with a golf cart on the golf course, I guess. But no,
Depends on which way you rotate it, Kim. That's what I learned in the end. Is one direction it's fine, and the other direction it's not as fine.
Sail left, maybe right. Depends on which way you're going. So noted. And so great fun facts. Hopefully everybody out there enjoys those, gets to know us a little bit better. But Christopher and Kevin are instrumental in supporting all of you, our customers. And so definitely excited to have them leading the conversation today. So with that, we'll start off at least with what is it? So oftentimes I will say contextual authentication can be called things like adaptive authentication. We also have seen it referenced as risk-based authentication. And back in the day of, I'd say around 2010, when I worked with the previous CEO of Pistol Star on it, we were calling it transparent authentication. So what is contextual authentication or any of those other terms really mean? Just a high level definition. Christopher, can you start us off with that?
Sure. I actually like to just refer to the source of the word itself. So contextual authentication is really about judging the authentication based on the context. So to boil that out just a little bit more high level, it's about taking some aspect of the scenario, whether it's the IP address or the browser that you're using, things of that nature, to say, hey, you have to do two-factor, or conversely, no, you don't have to do two-factor. In fact, we're going to just block you, right? It's just adjusting the authentication requirements based on the login itself, not the person necessarily.
Right. So the context of their situation, and I know that there's multiple pieces of context that some folks, that you can basically pull in and look at. Christopher, what are the ones that right now Portalguard supports in terms of the different pieces of context we can use?
Sure. I already kind of threw out a few of the more obvious ones. IP address, geolocation are some of the big ticket items. Browser enrollment, whether or not you've actually performed two-factor in that browser, is another really good one. And then obviously things like time or anything like that are another one. And then the last one, not used very frequently, but still popular, is basically Wi-Fi security. So if you're on a secure or public network, those kind of things.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we hear about the geography one, I think most often, right? Those are the stories where actually we had a customer I worked with that said that they had a worker who was supposedly working in California. And once they implemented contextual authentication, they started realizing that they were actually working out of Utah. And so things like that, you don't necessarily know until you set up the policy to go block any access that's outside of the California office, and that user is found out as not being there. So I hear about geography a lot. Kevin, anything to add there in terms of contextual authentication, or you think we hit most of the topic?
Oh, I mean, I think you hit most of the topic here. It's really just a solution to have the system, define when a user should be prompted for more or not, or blocked or allowed or not. And I mean, like I said, you guys really kind of like hit all the nails on the head. I don't have a lot to add there beyond that, Kim.
Yeah, no, I think, and actually you're reminding me, sometimes we phrase it as the appropriate amount of authentication for the situation, right? And I think it's like Christopher said, you can full out block a request, right? So that goes to more the extreme and potentially, everybody's about zero trust and not letting things in until you trust them, et cetera. You can really lock down access, but it gives you the flexibility to go the other direction, right? With the lighten it up a little bit if you know that they're in the right context for the access that they're requesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really clutch is like, I think there's maybe a view or an assumption that, well, like, this is always going to be about limiting what behaviors a user is allowed to do, right? Or what access I'm going to allow a user based on that. And sometimes it's more about being more permissive. If they're in the office and they're, I determined that by like an IP range or something, and they're from a system that I recognize, and maybe they had already authenticated this morning with MFA. Then, aren't I pretty confident that that's who they say they are and they're the type of person I want, doing XYZ? And so, sometimes it's about being more permissive than restrictive. And I think that, like I said, that there's kind of an assumption there that this is just really about like, blocking attackers and not necessarily about helping users, but it can be both.
Right. And I think that somewhat goes into the next benefit, right? Where, I mean, out of all the, whatever we always say, 15 plus authentication methods that we offer, you have this huge, plethora of options to choose from, but contextual really lets it be more dynamic, right? It's really going to let it balance the convenience and the security. What are some of the other key benefits, either Christopher or Kevin, that you've also called out, or maybe in that same vein, that you've seen customers experience or is part of contextual authentication?
Well, I like I said, the permissiveness is a big one, and being restrictive. But some of the nice things that you can do, that kind of tie into that, are, the analytics reports that come along with it, right? Like you'd mentioned this user coming out of Utah. A lot of times when you implement these kind of policies, you learn some stuff about the way that your users are utilizing their systems, right? And that's one of those kind of like occasionally hidden benefits where it doesn't maybe like pop out on the screen at you. But I mean, the world is behavioral analytics is like an entire industry in and of itself, right? And I mean, this day and age, you look at like Facebook and the customer is the product, right? I don't want to get into that too deeply. I apologize, but like, it's a whole thing, right? I mean, it exists, and it's like it's its own sect. And you can really learn some interesting things about your users and how they use, your systems. You might even learn something, you didn't realize that you had a lot of users dialing in to access Salesforce because they, didn't have access externally or something. You know what I mean? I don't know if that's a good example, but you can learn a lot.
Yeah, yep. That reminds me of, I've heard oftentimes customers talk about single sign-on and apps to single sign-on to applications lets them figure out shadow IT, right? Just by the nature of having to integrate those applications, well, the person's going to have to let you know they're using the application in the first place. So like you said, that's a interesting kind of hidden benefit to contextual authentication. Christopher, how about you? Any tangible benefits you've either seen directly with customers or kind of high level benefits you don't think we've hit upon yet?
Yeah, probably the biggest one that comes up a lot once you get on with the conversation, but is the ability to balance the usability and security aspects. Because when you're trying to deploy multi-factor, one of the most common things to come up is, hey, my users don't like this, it's too restrictive, or they're always having to do two-factor, etc. How can I make this easier but not reduce the security to a point where it's kind of null and void? Contextual authentication helps to address that issue by allowing you to find that balance and kind of strike it relatively easily, but within a flexible nature. So you can say, just like Kevin was saying earlier, hey, there's certain conditions under which you don't have to do two-factor because it doesn't really give you any additional benefit.
Right. Yeah, it's too restrictive, right? Essentially, you're enforcing stronger authentication than's actually necessary for the situation at hand. Yep. And
No, that's a really good point, Kim. I mean, that's the big one, right? Like, is again, do I trust a user that's at my facility, that's sitting at one of my computers, that's signed in, and I've done a push authentication, maybe with like because we support do a push, or like I mean, there are certain situations where I should be able to have such a high confidence in who this person is and what they're trying to access that I shouldn't have to bother them anymore. And that's that's a really nice potential, because we talk all the time about, how long it takes to enter passwords, or how long, throughout the day, right? Well, it only takes a few seconds. Okay, if I do that 30 times a day, that adds up, right? And that adds up over a work week, and that adds up over a work year, and that's potentially a lot of lost time. And anytime that I can, reduce those kind of like obstructions to productivity, those are ROI potentials.
Right. No, 100%. And I think, what I've seen is the zero trust talk track has come in quite a bit. And I think that there's a lot of concept around that in terms of making sure that you're only trusting things once they're, verified, validated, vetted identities, et cetera. But there's also the concept of trusting, enough in the context of the user to then augment the situation or augment the authentication. So I think it's a fine balance, and I see organizations trying to go one way or the other. And I think contextual authentication, at least from the benefit I highlight, is doesn't force you to decide. So just as much as you can give options for the authentication the person has to do, it gives you also that additional layer of flexibility for not only the options at the point of authentication, but what level of authentication are we going to enforce? So there's definitely a granularity there. And I think that's a little bit of a hint to the next question that we definitely kind of joked about when we were prepping for this, but what's the key challenge, right? So if we're talking about all these fine-grained policies and everything, I'm hinting at it, but Christopher, what would you say is probably one of the key challenges that customers have when trying to put contextual authentication in place?
Probably the biggest one is lack of understanding of the scope. And I know that's kind of vague, but it really comes down to not simply saying, hey, I want to implement contextual authentication to potentially make things easier for everybody, but it's actually understanding what that means for your environment. Too often people look at this, and you can see it printed on there as a logic puzzle. Too many people look at it and say, oh yeah, there's way too many things that I have to configure, when in reality you might only need to configure one or two different settings, and going in knowing precisely what you need to change is going to help streamline that a lot. That, and obviously test. You can't say that enough, especially when it comes with contextual authentication. You really have to know what you want and then test and prove that, yes, this is in fact actually what I wanted.
Yeah, and so expanding on that a little bit, I remember when we were talking about this in preparation for this discussion, you called it logical acrobatics, I think was maybe the term you used. But how do you think about this? Should people look at the forest first and then try to segment out groups of trees? Or, you know, if you're kind of going that analogy, do they get right into the individual users and the trees first? Or what type of approach have you seen work best?
I think it's always better, at least from implementation standpoint, to look at the forest before you dive into the trees, really, because if you start too laser focused, you'll almost always find that, oh, this scope didn't include this group of users, and wait, now that they're in, that's a whole new IP range or a whole new device type that I have to manage. Now I have to go back and update this policy to expand it from there. When really, if you started out and then kind of tweaked it while moving in, it ends up being a lot easier to manage and a lot easier to think through. One of the reasons I say logical acrobatics is when you start throwing multiple conditions of different types at each other and then trying to align those to a specific authentication type, whether it's, oh, hey, if X and Y are met but not Z, you have to do two-factor. But if X, Y, and Z are met, you do have to do, it's blocked access. Trying to keep all those in line can be a little hairy if you're not sitting there with a clear scope of where all this applies. And then, of course, we like to add wrinkles into the thing by giving you more flexibility and saying, hey, in fact, you can actually invert those to make it a not condition. And I joked about this a little bit in preparation with Kevin too. Like, yeah, as soon as you put the word not in there, even people like me who finally have a grasp of, logical operators are going to sit there and like, wait, how does that work again? And sometimes it gets me too. So again, just being clear on what you want. And like you said, Kim, starting by looking at the forest and not getting lost in the individual tree initially is probably a good help.
Yeah, and so even just talking about that, right? The XYZ combinations, it's really if, then, or statements, right? You can get pretty intense. What type of, if I'm trying to picture a project plan to implement this, what have you seen customers bring to you that you think worked really well, or maybe lack thereof? Like, is it actually a project plan and you map each, group and individuals to the type of controls that you want? Or what's the approach there, just to help maybe visualize that a little bit more?
Sure. In terms of Portalguard, the biggest success that I've seen comes with starting with the high-level questions of who needs two-factor authentication or who needs contextual authentication. But in most cases, that conversation starts with who needs two-factor authentication. Because when you're looking at contextual, it comes down to, do we want to block access, provide two-factor authentication, or just let them in normally with a username and password? And you're really looking at this from a security perspective. So you start with the high level question, who needs two-factor or who needs these conditions? Great. Is it everybody? Yes, no. If no, let's get the specific groups. And then you drill down from there again into, okay, under what conditions do we really need this extended authentication, we'll call it, because I don't want to keep harrowing in on contextual until we've really gotten a full grasp of it. So it's like, everybody, nail down the groups and then start looking at the specific user scenarios. And then from there, trigger the conditions and start looking at it. So, okay, so we've got all these overlaps. So I've got 3 groups, just for example. I've got 3 groups where I don't care if they do two-factor on the network as long as they've done it once on that machine. Great. Now I can put all 3 of these together. I don't have to do 3 separate things, all with the same condition for 3 separate groups. I can just do it once. So kind of, again, starting out wider and then scoping in once you have an idea of, hey, here are all the users that need this. Here are all the conditions for these users. Where's the overlap? Let me configure it from there.
Okay. No, that makes a ton of sense. That makes a ton of sense. As a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions about some of the things we're covering here, so how to configure this, how to tackle this logic problem or puzzle as we're calling it, or even just about contextual authentication, please feel free to submit some questions. In terms of kind of the options we can give users, I know one of the things that comes up pretty often is passwordless. So Kevin, I'm going to put you a little on the spot, but can you talk just really quick about how passwordless can be used? Like, let's say the context of the authentications, checks out. What type of passwordless options do we offer or could offer to our customers that are listening in?
Absolutely. So I mean, really, in that scenario, you can, and I'm going to refer to this. Passwordless is a good term. I'm going to call it single factor as well because I use that term a lot. But BioKey offers, fingerprint biometrics authentication, and later this year we'll be doing some work around facial and out of band authentic. We talked a little bit about this in the earlier seminar, or last week or the week before. But we'll be doing some of these like additional methods that are becoming really popular, and we're excited to expand those technologies. But basically, where those go is like if you consider our advanced authentication or our biometric advanced authentication, we could do something like our PG desktop app as an example, where you're doing a Windows authentication and you've trusted the user because they did some SSO sign in or that kind of thing. Or an even better scenario actually is an unlock scenario where we could do something like if we trust the user because they signed into their Windows desktop or their Portalguard session with an advanced authentication method and they passed all the other contextual checks previously, we can allow them to, let's say, lock the computer and go to lunch, and then they come back to sit down, and and we can allow them to just use that single factor, their finger or their YubiKey or their duo push or whatever method we've determined as admins that the users should be allowed to have. We can allow them to just unlock that system without having to gate anything in front of them or require an additional password to do a full two-factor or multi-factor in that scenario. And that can be really powerful. I mean, like I said, we were talking a little bit earlier, or I was at least, about that. The time that it takes to enter passwords, and yeah, it's a couple of seconds, but again, over the course of a day, if I do that 20 times, well, okay, now you're talking about a minute or two. And then if you extrapolate that over a week, okay, well, now that's like 10 or 15 minutes of my employee's day or my employee's work week. And then if I extrapolate, I mean, that's a break, right? That's like an extra break basically that they're taking, in time.
That's lunch you don't get.
Sorry, what's that?
That's lunch we're not getting.
Exactly. And so, extrapolate that over a month or into a year or over a career, and you're actually talking about potentially a significant amount of time.
Right.
And the drive in industry, I mean, has been for decades, productivity. This is where we gain profitability, right? And that plays into it.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. And the reason I bring up the passwordless is, Christopher, I think you made a great point, which is look at how you're going to control things, right? Especially starting with the MFA. And then it's kind of on that spectrum of like blocked to letting them in, right? Completely, which I haven't seen that very often. But basically, it gives you that kind of range of things to choose from. And I think passwordless is on kind of that over towards the convenience side of that range. But it's definitely worth mentioning for sure. So.
Absolutely.
The other question, Christopher, I wanted to ask you is these policies are intertwined, right? And configuring them and setting them up. But fun question is, when should you revisit them? So, in terms of setting what criteria you have, user groups, when are you seeing people revisit the system that they set up or the hierarchy of user segmentation, and what would you recommend?
Sure. So frequently it comes down to whenever you have new users to consider. It tends to be when people I've worked with tend to actually go back and say, okay, is this still a good policy? I always say for contextual, because it is trying to strike the balance between usability and security, you should really be setting up kind of a regular time to at least go in and review that these conditions still make sense for these users. The way I like to think of it is for like a big corporation, especially one that likes to promote from within. You might have a group of users that are, hey, these are interns, okay? Interns don't have access to anything, so even if you were to compromise their credentials, all they can get into is to be able to read their own mail. So we don't necessarily need them to do two-factor if they're online. But if you set up all those policies based on the username, if that user gets promoted to a full staff member with administrative rights, and the contextual never changes for them. Now you've got a potential admin who's not required to do two-factor, can get in on a dime, and if they are subject to a phishing attack, the contextual is not going to help prevent them from accessing anything. So having a good plan in place, whether it's quarterly or even biannually, something like that, just regularly going through and saying, okay, do these conditions still matter for these users? The other flip side to that is evaluate how you're actually defining the policies. The example I just gave referenced user-specific definitions, which, for the reason I gave, are not always the best because they don't account for shifts in back-end corporate procedures or policies that should apply to that user. If you use something like group access to define the restrictions, then you have a little bit more leeway to say, okay, anybody in this group should only ever have to do 2FA under these conditions. And then it comes a matter of reviewing your groups on your actual domain. But standard best practice for, in my opinion, any authentication scenario is to establish a regular review of the requirements to make sure they still make sense, because this field's always evolving. There's really no legitimate reason to expect that all these MFA conditions are always going to be valid all the time.
Right. And it sounds like there's time-based kind of check-ins that you'd want to do, but then there's also situational. Like you said, if a group changes or access or promotion, there's kind of these situational events that happen that's worth revisiting. What are the contextual-based authentication criteria defined for Portalguard specifically? And so it seems like the questions around the Azure AD, contextual authentication or access. And so anything there, Christopher or Kevin, in terms of maybe just recap on the context we can configure based on, and if either of you have any information on the Azure AD side of that, that would be great too.
I'll defer to Christopher. He's got more knowledge on the nuts and bolts of this than I do, that's for sure.
No worries. Kevin's our resident biometric expert, by the way. He walking, talking, eat, sleep, breathe biometrics. So we're gonna give you time, Kevin, too.
No worries.
Sure. So with Portalguard, again, I'll cover those real quick. You have certain conditions like IP address, geolocation, which interestingly enough is a variation on specifying an IP range. You also have registered devices. In this case, we defer to the browser for that particular condition. And then the time, so actually like time of day, and Wi-Fi security are other options that Portalguard supports. In comparison to the Azure AD contextual authentication, the things like unmanaged devices, again, Azure has this thing called hybrid join devices where they actually put a little bit of mobile device management, well, maybe not mobile, but device management integration on the device itself, which does give them a little bit more access to the unit. Again, that's a lot more setup that you have to do as an organization. Portalguard, on the other hand, it actually defers to the browser, not the device itself in most cases, to automate that process. Now, the flip side of that, right, is if you're using the browser and they do something like a Tor browser or an incognito mode, that browser is forever going to be seen as unregistered. So they'll, for the one session, they might only have to do 2FA once, but the next time they try to log in, it's going to be flagged as not a registered browser, and they'll have to do it again. And again, that is by design. If you can't keep the browser registered, then you have to keep doing 2FA. So yeah, for the most part, there's a lot of overlap there, but it really ties down to how it's implemented. Portalguard doesn't have the direct tie into the devices that Azure AD does, but the flip side of that is it's a lot less setup and maintenance on that end.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, even that was over my head, I can tell you that, in terms of my expertise on contextual. So that was great, Christopher, digging in and comparing those two. It also reminds me, I think we were talking about this before, of when we first developed, like way back in the day, contextual authentication for Portalguard, and then there was a lot more factors and a lot more context, but you have to be careful about A, how reliable it is, B, how consistent it is. And so, we've definitely gotten it honed down to be the best version of these attributes that we can look at, and now continue to build upon those as to what we think are really important or what customers are looking for. So, some of those things I've seen throughout the days, you expand and contract the context that you can bring in, has happened throughout kind of the development of this as a concept in most IAM platforms. So
Okay, I think it's important because Christopher had hit on this too, and you just did, but just want to highlight it. I mean, you know, a lot of times user access or you know, from the location, the individual user, what types of things they need to access is a constantly moving target, right? Because, you know, someone goes through a promotion or takes on a new responsibility, someone takes on a responsibility while someone is on vacation. You know, those things shift frequently, and so it's important to pay attention and to have some flexibility built into your system and into your contextual plan, the contextual authentication plan that allows you to account for edge cases.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's it's interesting because it reminds me of working in healthcare. You need to know people's workflows or what their day is, right? And even over the past year, we've seen a lot of change in people's working environments and situations. So, you know, implementing it is definitely possible. It is a logic exercise, I think, in a lot of ways. But once it's configured and in place, you know, the benefits on both security and usability side, I would say, are just above and beyond basic MFA.
Yeah, and if I can, I don't think we've really hit on this yet, but I mean, that's where it becomes so clutch, potentially to be thinking about pilot groups, pilot users, pilot groups, even in a larger group, right? So you can get some feedback on, does my plan work before I'm impacting, you know, an entire group of users? I'm hopefully only picking on, you know, my pilot group and not beating up on everybody else with something that doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly. The rollout of it. And is that what you would both recommend, I guess, is the gradual rollout of this? I mean, I know we recommend it with multi-factor for sure. You don't want to just turn it on. Is that the same here? Is what I'm hearing, Kevin, you say. I'm hearing Christopher a little bit of a chuckle.
For me, absolutely. I would never just flip the switch on something like that, especially when it comes down to, did I get my logic straight, right? Like, you know, not just like, is it on or off, but is it on or off in all these like weird eventualities? I mean, it almost becomes like, it's not, but I mean, it's almost like a quantum problem, right? Like, is it in one state or is it the other? Have I measured it yet or not? You know, so like for me, I'm always big on pilot groups, lots of communication. Before I ever did anything like this to my users, when I was a sysadmin, I definitely would have made sure I'd send out a couple of emails a couple of weeks in advance. Hey, by the way, we're changing something, we're turning this on, we're deploying this new thing, you know, be ready for it, you know, et cetera, et cetera. You know, communication and pilot groups for me are like big, whether I'm turning on contextual authentication or I'm moving to Office 365, you know what I mean? Like it doesn't matter. Like those things are always important. Test.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm gonna piggyback on that too. Like I said before, test. You can't say it enough, but even if you ask any other customer who's ever worked with me, if you submit a support issue, even about the contextual authentication or pretty much anything else, one of the first questions I'll ask is, did you do this in test first? Because that should always be the first step, especially like Kevin's saying, when logic is involved, because it is just too simple to say, yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. This is exactly how it should work. I'm going to roll this out to 1,500 people. And then 10 minutes later, I've got 800 calls on hold at my help desk going, yeah, now I can't get into my system. What did you guys change?
Right.
And it's all because, oh, actually, that's a not, so this is a negative. Oh, sorry, let me uncheck that. And you know, you figure that out within 5 seconds of putting it on a pilot group. So yeah, you should, you know, if you're thinking, do I need to test this? The answer is yes. I don't even need to know what the rest of the question is. That's the answer.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. I also learned, like, don't start with your doctors if you're in healthcare, and your CEO is probably not the first person I would go with. But I think this has been great. You know, I think it's a good coverage of what is contextual authentication, what are the key benefits, right? In terms of a quick recap, right? It's the way to really balance security and convenience for users. You can tighten up authentication when you need to, especially when the context is showing something that might be higher risk, but then loosen that up for users, customers, and employees that basically can show their context is in a reasonable, digestible security for you. So I think that's really key. Yes, it's a little bit of a challenge. I think we've called that out today. It is a logic puzzle, and requires some forethought and planning and strategy in segmenting your users, but it's absolutely possible, and is honestly become a key staple of many IAM strategies we're seeing all of you and our prospects as well using. So, all right. So going back to just wrap things up, this wraps up our 3-part series of our MFA edition of Ask Me Anything. If you still have any questions regarding multi-factor authentication, of course, any other subject with Portalguard or BioKey solutions, please don't hesitate to ask. We're more than happy to schedule a customer success call with any of us on the team to talk about your requirements, make sure you're getting the most value out of the solutions you're using. And with that, I will thank everybody for joining today. And of course, my sidekicks for this session and series, Kevin and Christopher, thank you so much. Great session.
Thank you, Kim. It was great.
Yes, thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.